Hello, welcome to the Student Thesis and Research Showcase. We have an outstanding group of presenters today, and I would like to acknowledge their amazing accomplishments that you will soon learn about. Engaging in research and completing a senior thesis is a considerable achievement, but doing so under these extraordinary conditions makes it even more significant. This past year, labs are closed, and reopening them resulted in a major shift in how research is being conducted. Yet today's presenters somehow managed to adapt and succeed. To the presenters, you not only demonstrated resilience, but a level of tenacity and determination to complete what you initially set out to accomplish. That is astounding and certainly inspiring. To those unfamiliar with what a senior thesis or independent research is, it can serve as a capstone to one's undergraduate education. It is an opportunity to engage in original research, collect and analyze data, and to add to the body of knowledge in a given field. It is a demonstration of their creativity, scholarship, and flexibility to meet new challenges. Today, they are presenting their projects and what they have accomplished this past year or so. Let's now learn what they have accomplished.
Hi, I'm Judy Harakevich, the faculty advisor for Kieran Barnett. Kieran's been working in our lab since fall 2018, and she's been working on her thesis for the majority of that time. She came into our lab with an interest in helping struggling students, and she's pursued that interest with grit and persistence, showing intellectual curiosity and insight as she designed her impressive thesis study. She's planning to pursue graduate study in psychology in the future, as well as continuing to participate in research in clinical psychology.
And I'm Michael Asher, the graduate student who helped to supervise Kieran's thesis. I'm very happy that I got to work with Kieran on this project, as her interests were a really nice match for my own, and she did great work in designing and carrying out this study. I'm really excited to see what she does next.
Student motivation in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM, is an important area of research because the job market for STEM careers has shown sustained growth since the 1960s, yet the number of qualified STEM professionals has not kept pace with this growth. This shortage of STEM professionals may be due to STEM attrition in education. In fact, almost half of all students who initially major in a STEM-related field switch out before graduating, and this issue has led researchers to ask the question, how do we create engaging environments that facilitate student motivation in STEM? Specifically, researchers in my lab are interested in utility value, or students' perceptions of usefulness, as research has shown that presenting students with usefulness information promotes interest and improves academic performance. However, utility information may actually undermine interest and performance for less confident students. In other words, students who are not very confident in their abilities actually report less interest and perform worse on subsequent tests when presented with usefulness information. Researchers believe that anxiety could be causing this undermining effect. This is because less confident students may become anxious when they believe they are bad at something that is highly consequential. My research then addresses the question, how can we help less confident students experience lowered anxiety in order to benefit from utility value information? My study was conducted online using Zoom, and my main manipulations were embedded into a statistics lecture. We presented students with two types of information to reduce anxiety about statistics. We manipulated whether participants were exposed to utility information or an attributional reframing manipulation. Participants in the utility condition were told that statistics would be useful for future careers, while participants in the reframing condition were told that even students who initially experience difficulty can ultimately excel at statistics. We believed that if we could shift less confident students' perceptions of their math skills from permanent to temporary, we may be able to motivate them because they would be more likely to believe they could improve their performance rather than give up. Our sample was not actually very anxious overall, which may have been due to conducting the study online instead of in person in a more high pressure context. We also found no significant effects of the attributional reframing manipulations on any dependent measures. However, we found a significant main effect of the utility value manipulation on perceptions of usefulness and task interest. On this graph, you can see utility value information had a positive effect on students' perceptions of usefulness for statistics. And on this graph, we can again see that the utility value manipulation had a positive effect on students' interest in statistics. So as I mentioned, our sample wasn't very anxious about statistics, so we failed to replicate the undermining effect of utility value information. However, our work is encouraging because it suggests that in a statistics learning paradigm, utility value manipulations have positive effects on students' perceptions of usefulness and interest, which have implications for persistence in STEM. Thank you to my collaborators, and thank you for your attention today.
My name is Catherine Scott, and I had the opportunity to serve as Meredith Bone's thesis mentor this past year in collaboration with Trish Devine and Kristen Schatz. Meredith is a thoughtful and diligent researcher and has grown tremendously in her independence throughout the execution of her thesis project. Each step of the way, Meredith has been really deeply engaged and involved in raising critical points that have really shaped the trajectory of her complicated thesis project. Meredith also has embraced opportunities to grow as a researcher. She seeks out feedback, is quick to implement changes as a result of this feedback. And this flexibility and adaptability will really serve Meredith extremely well in her future career. I really look forward to seeing where she goes next.
Children develop racial biases early in life. These biases are most pervasive in white children and have an incredibly harmful impact on BIPOC children. This highlights a need for intervention with white children. However, many previous attempts to reduce children's biases have failed. Often, this is because short lab interventions with children don't yield long-lasting results. So, a place we can start is by involving parents in these interventions. Parents spend a lot of time with their kids and have a lot of influence and control over their children's lives. Parents also have the regulatory skills that children lack. So, parents have the means to help children transition what they learn into the real world over a longer period of time. However, many parents don't believe that their children show racial biases, which leads them to believe that there are no consequences because there's no issue to be addressed. And if there's no issue to be addressed, there's no motivation to make a change. One of the main purposes of this project is to increase parents' motivation to reduce their children's biases. So we developed an intervention program that focuses on 4 components of bias reduction training: awareness of, concern about, motivation to regulate, and self-efficacy in addressing bias. We know from previous research that awareness and concern are essential components for adults to maintain their motivation to reduce their own biases. So, borrowing from this idea, if we want to increase parents' motivation to reduce their children's biases, we first need to increase their awareness and concern. To do this, one component of the program included some examples of children expressing bias and the scientific evidence about the prevalence and consequences of bias. To help further increase motivation, we highlighted the importance of early intervention for racial biases. To increase self-efficacy, we accentuated parents' potential in guiding their children's attitudes. And we also provided strategies that parents can use with their children. This way, they don't feel quite as helpless or unsure about discussing this topic. Through questionnaires distributed at 3 different time points, we measured these 4 components that we're aiming to increase. An example item for each measure is listed here on the slide. For example, an item for self-efficacy is I am confident that I can catch bias in my child's behavior. We are still in the process of collecting data for the full study and hope to finish collecting data from 240 parents by the end of the summer. However, some of our preliminary data indicate that compared to a control, parents who completed an intervention that informed them about the prevalence of racial bias in children experienced increases in their awareness of, concern about, and motivation to regulate children's biases. We hope that with this intervention, we'll be able to increase each of these components so that parents may turn these ideas into action and we may see long-lasting bias reduction in children. And we'll be hearing from Olivia next about some concrete strategies with which we can equip parents to help this process along. Thank you.
My name's Catherine Scott, and I was incredibly fortunate to be Olivia Moen's thesis mentor this past year in collaboration with Trish Devine and Kristen Schatz. Olivia's really thrived in the execution of a complicated thesis project and has adopted a level of initiative that is uncommon amongst undergraduate students. Olivia's really smart, motivated, and hardworking, and she's been an incredible mentor to younger students in the lab and has really become a role model for an exceptional researcher. I'm really excited to watch Olivia continue honing her academic and professional skills in a school psychology graduate program next year. I'm sure she will continue doing great work in the service of helping children throughout our society.
From Meredith's presentation, we know parents can be motivated to address their children's racial bias, but what's the most appropriate way for them to do so? We know from research with adults on the self-regulation of prejudice that people need awareness and strategies to actually overcome their racial biases. The question here becomes what strategies might be effective for parents to implement with their children, and how can parents be encouraged to use these strategies? In our intervention, we teach parents how to implement evidence-based strategies to address children's racial bias through the reading of storybooks. The first strategy, individuation, emphasizes an individual's unique characteristics over the stereotypes placed upon the social group to which they belong. The next strategy is perspective taking and involves putting yourself in someone else's shoes in order to encourage empathy and the recognition of similarities. Intergroup contact highlights the importance of exposure to people who have different views, experiences, and other unique aspects of life. After receiving general descriptions of each strategy, parents were given concrete examples that they could use with the race-related books they would read with their children. By using all three of these strategies, we take a multifaceted approach to addressing children's racial bias in different contexts. We hope this will create more generalizable effects than only implementing a single strategy. 240 white parents and their 5 to 7-year-old children were randomly assigned to either an intervention or control condition. Regardless of condition, baseline measures are collected during week 1 of this longitudinal study. Immediately following, parents in the intervention condition received all intervention materials, which included a training program and 4 race-related books in order to complete the book readings in weeks 2 and 3. Parents in the control condition received 4 books about animals, which were completely unrelated to race. In week 4, we'd gather data for our first post-test, and in week 18, we'd follow up with a second post-test. After all data had been collected, we'd send out the training program and race-related books for the parents in the control condition. Our measures include tolerance for discrimination, a social preference task, and prediction of parent attitudes. I'm now going to present some data from a pilot study we recently ran. Note that similar trends were observed for all 3 measures, but I'm going to focus on the social preference measure. On this measure, children were shown 6 trials that looked like this. On each trial, they were asked with which child they would like to be friends with. On this graph, you'll see bias scores on the y-axis. Scores above 0 indicated pro-white bias, and scores below 0 indicated pro-black bias. The bars will represent pre- and post-test assessments. So as you can see, children's pro-white bias decreased from pre-test to post-test. As of today, we are working on data collection and have completed 70 parent-child dyad baseline measures. We hope to finish data collection in early August in order to analyze and publish soon after. I'd like to thank all of my collaborators for making this project possible.
Hey everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce Diane Camarda as she presents her Hilldale Honors Thesis on screening for depression in college students using social media activity. Diane has been a core member of our lab since August of 2018, and in that time she's been invaluable to us and has impressed everyone who's worked with her. Diane's intellectual curiosity and drive have situated her as a key contributor to an emerging program of research that combines personal sensing methods and machine learning to deliver precision mental health care. Working closely with one of my graduate students, Sarah Santana, Diane has collected social media data and completed structural clinical interviews on over 850 participants to establish if they had depression or substance use disorders, 2 classes of psychiatric illness that are highly prevalent on college campuses. Diane's work in this area has already yielded a first authored poster and the prestigious Hilldale Fellowship. Diane's charisma and leadership has been a model for everyone in the lab, and she continues to play an important mentoring role to other students who are starting research for the first time in our lab. I have no doubt that we'll continue to see great things from Diane as she moves forward to the next stages of her academic career. Thanks for everything, Diane. We appreciate it.
Today, I will be presenting on machine-assisted screening for depression in college students. I did this research as a part of the Addiction Research Lab in the Department of Psychology under the mentorship of PhD candidate Sarah Santana and Dr. John Curtin. College is a formative period in many young adults' lives. Unfortunately, today's students face unprecedented levels of depression. Since the average onset of depression falls within college years, college students are at an increased risk for both short-term and long-term effects. Additionally, the average time between the emergence of depression and first treatment seeking is 3 years, with even longer averages for historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups. Public health efforts have focused on increasing earlier identification of depression to motivate treatment seeking and target depression symptoms before they become severe. Current screening procedures happen in one of two settings, primary care and at a university, and typically involve completing brief screeners for symptoms of depression like the STaRS shown here. Universities typically only administer mass screening at the beginning of the school year, if at all, and primary care settings only screen when the patient is coming in for other complaints. Would you be likely to answer questions accurately when you're coming in for a sinus infection or the flu? Furthermore, these screeners ask for how you've been feeling in the last 1 or 2 weeks. If you aren't in the midst of a depressive episode, the screeners may not catch you. This brings me to our current project. Our goal is to find a widespread, low-burden method to screen undergraduates for depression and motivate them to seek treatment. One way we can do this is through machine learning analysis of social media data. We chose to work with private messages specifically because they're less likely to be filtered than other social media data sources, and they're dynamic, meaning that the content may change based on the mental state of the individual. These private messages are available through the data download feature of Facebook. The top image is some of the data sources that Facebook allows you to download, with messages highlighted in red. We brought participants into the lab as part of another project, downloaded their full Facebook data, and administered the SESD, which is the questionnaire you saw part of on the previous slide. Since we have so much data, machine learning techniques are essential to help us turn text into usable data for prediction and build models that can generalize to new samples. The first thing that we did was withhold 20% of the data that we have yet to touch so that we can accurately estimate model generalizability at the end of the project. Next, we focused on dictionary-based feature extraction methods such as Luke. Luke is a dictionary created for work like this that organizes English into a variety of potentially predictive categories. Examples of these categories can be seen on the right. You can imagine that people who use more words in the negative affect category may be more likely to have depression. Finally, we built our model using tenfold cross-validation and logistic regression. We evaluate our model using accuracy and the ROC area under the curve, which is the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. The graph on the right shows the ROC area under the curve. The dashed line is chance, the red line is the ideal, and the black line is where our model currently is, with an accuracy of 0.86 and an area under the curve of 0.83. As you can see, our model is performing well. We are very encouraged by the initial strong performance of our data in the training set, but the true test of our model's predictive ability will be when we assess our final model in the test set. Once there, we can move the discussion to implementation. I want to thank all the members of the Addiction Research Lab that contributed to my success, and I want to thank all of you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Hi, my name is Sean Green, and it's my pleasure to introduce my student, Zach Demko. Zach joined my lab in the fall of 2018, and over the last 3 years, more accomplishments than I could easily list in 30 seconds. So I'll kind of go one way that he's particularly unique. I've had a number of undergraduates who have been co-authors on published papers after they've graduated. Zach's actually my first student to be an author on published paper while he's still an undergraduate, and actually he's an author on not 1 but 2 published works thus far. When he finishes up at UW, he's going to be moving on to the post-bac program at NIH, and I think he's got a really bright research future ahead of him. So look forward to his talk and continuing to see his development.
Thank you for the introduction. Addiction is a clear threat to public mental health, but while addictions to substances like opioids have deep foundations in research, addictions to behaviors like playing video games are still less well understood. While research has explored whether people can become addicted to video games, it still has not yet been shown whether people can actually lose control of their gaming, which is a basic component of addiction. It tested whether they could by examining whether students who met the proposed criteria for video game addiction could reduce the amount of time they spent gaming when they had exams. If they could not, then that might show that they were unable to control their gaming behavior. As a secondary question, I asked, do participants accurately estimate the amount of time they spend gaming? I tested this question by comparing self-reported gaming hours to objective measurements. To help answer both of these questions, I identified 2 groups of participants using a reliable scale. One consisting of students with lots of symptoms of video game addiction, and a second consisting of students with very few symptoms of video game addiction, but who nonetheless played lots of video games. At the beginning of the study, participants in both groups submitted their syllabi so I could see which weeks of their semesters had exams in them. And then each week, they completed a survey with 2 pieces. 1, questions asking about how much time the participants spent gaming and studying over the past week, and 2, the Internet Gaming Disorder Scale, which assessed their addiction symptoms over the past week. I also acquired objective measurements of how much time they spent gaming. So what did we find? Surprisingly, we did not find evidence that participants in the addicted group played video games more persistently during exam weeks than did participants in the non-addicted group. In other words, we did not find evidence that people who met the proposed criteria for video game addiction actually lost control of their gaming behavior. However, we also examined the accuracy of self-reported gaming hours. This graph shows the total number of hours that participants spent gaming over the entire semester. The red bars will be how much time they self-reported playing, and the blue bars will be objective measurements. Participants in the non-addicted group self-reported playing games for much less time than they actually played. And participants in the addicted group did so to an even greater extent. It turns out that self-reports of time spent gaming might be very inaccurate, which has important implications for research that relies on these kinds of self-reports. However, the basic lens through which I approached this research may have been flawed. Recent research has suggested that we can't place mental illnesses into different neat categories. Rather, mental illness is more complicated and dynamic. Future research should examine how video games might exacerbate or otherwise interact with mental illness in general, rather than attempting to identify a neat category of video game addiction.
Hello, I'm Erin Costanzo, professor in psychiatry in the Carbone Cancer Center. It is my pleasure to introduce Michaela Foster, a psychology major who has been a member of my psychosocial oncology lab for the past 3 years. Michaela's project focuses on chronic graft versus host disease, or CGVHD, a common complication for cancer survivors who have had stem cell transplants. There are few effective medical treatments for CGVHD, and there is strong interest in utilizing behavioral and palliative approaches to improve symptom management. However, we first need to know which symptoms are most problematic. Michaela's study addresses this gap in knowledge and has the potential to make a significant impact in improving the care of cancer survivors. Michaela's work is supported by a Hilldale Award and has been recently presented at the annual meetings of the American Society for Transplantation and Cellular Therapies, the American Psycho-Oncology Society, and the UW Carbone Cancer Center Research Retreat. Please welcome Michaela.
For patients that are diagnosed with hematologic and lymphoid cancers, allogeneic hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is a standard of care. Unfortunately, 30 to 70% of those undergoing this transplant will develop chronic graft versus host disease. And while the clinical manifestations are well characterized, little is known about the disease's impact on psychological and physical function. We evaluated psychological and physical function in 251 allogeneic transplant patients at pre-transplant as well as post-transplant milestones of 6 months, 1 year, and 3 years. We compared those who had developed CGVHD to those who had not at each of these time points. Our first aim was to compare psychological function through the use of measures of anxiety and depression symptoms between these groups at these post-transplant milestones. Our second aim was to compare physical function, where we used patient-reported outcome measures of fatigue, pain, and sleep disturbance between these same groups at these same milestones. Our third aim was to evaluate the extent to which CGVHD severity of grades 1 through 3 in this table is associated with impairment in psychological and physical function. Looking at our results for psychological function, those who develop CGVHD are in red, and our findings show that patients that develop CGVHD have comparable levels of anxiety and depression to those that do not develop CGVHD. Now looking at physical function, again, those who develop CGVHD are in red. For fatigue on the top graph, we see that those with CGVHD had significantly worse fatigue intensity at 6 months and 3 years post-transplant, and the dashed line shows the cut point for clinically significant fatigue. However, there were no significant differences of fatigue interference here on the bottom graph. Moving to pain, those with CGVHD had significantly worse pain intensity at 1 year and 3 years post-transplant here on the top graph. And we also see that those with CGVHD showed worse pain interference on this bottom graph at 3 years post-transplant. With regard to sleep, we see that those with CGVHD reported significantly more sleep disturbance at 3 years post-transplant, And we also see that those with CGVHD had shorter sleep durations at 6 months post-transplant on this bottom graph. With regard to our third aim of the study, disease severity was not found to be associated with psychological or physical function. However, this may have been a result of our sample size being too small in these groups due to deaths and other aspects of attrition, and this should be further researched. We also repeated analyses focused only on those patients with active CGVHD, as defined by those who were prescribed immunosuppressants at the time of the assessment, and we saw the same patterns of findings. So overall, while those with CGVHD are a relatively resilient group with regard to psychological function, they are still at risk for impaired physical function. As such, fatigue, pain, and sleep are promising intervention targets for improving function and quality of life of those with CGVHD. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Yuri Miyamoto. It is my great pleasure to introduce Claire Gerard. Claire has been working in our culture and cognition lab for a very long time and has been a truly indispensable member of our lab, even serving as our lab manager for 2 years. So for her honors thesis, she has been examining how social anxiety trait is associated with psychological and physiological stress responses to an acute stressor among both European American and Asian students. And I have to add that Claire worked so hard and so well to induce the stress among these students, which was not an easy task. So Claire is passionate to understand mental health issues in diverse cultural contexts and to pursue a career in psychology. So I look forward to her continuing success in the future.
Thank you for the introduction. Long-term stress has significant implications for both physical and emotional health across and between cultures. So how might social stress play a role? This study examined both individualist cultures and collectivist cultures. In individualist cultures, in part because of the more relaxed emphasis on social ties and social harmony, we tend to see lower levels of social anxiety or fear of negative evaluation. Fear of negative evaluation is as it sounds, stress over the negative opinions of the self from others. In contrast, we tend to see higher levels of social anxiety or fear of negative evaluation in collectivist cultures. However, it's difficult to make predictions about how this will be reflected in cortisol, a stress hormone, as there are mixed findings for both cultures. While we might anticipate that collectivist cultures could be more responsive to changes in state anxiety, we need to examine cortisol. Given the physiological health impacts of long-term stress, it's important we understand the expression of stress both biologically and emotionally, hence our study. In this exploratory study, we investigated how the social anxiety trait is associated with state anxiety and cortisol levels within and across cultures in response to social stress in a non-clinical sample. We conducted a Trier social stress test to elicit a salivary cortisol release in response to social stress triggers. Our study included 200 participants, 101 of which were European Americans and 99 of which were East Asian. Participants completed a pre-session survey before coming into the lab, and baseline state anxiety data were collected. 20 minutes into the study, baseline cortisol levels were collected. They were then read the instructions and state anxiety data were collected. They completed the speech and math tasks or the Trier social stress test, and then post-task samples were collected. In the final 20 minutes of our study, we collected the last state anxiety data and our final 2 cortisol samples. First, let's examine cortisol results. In this graph, we see cortisol recovery 1 results separated by ethnicity, with European Americans in green and East Asians in red. We see that fear of negative evaluation did predict recovery 1 levels. This shows that higher fear of negative evaluation predicted higher cortisol levels after the task, potentially implying slower recovery from socially stressful events. Next, we have state anxiety results, specifically anticipatory anxiety again split by ethnicity. Fear of negative evaluation predicted anticipatory state anxiety levels. The data showed a positive correlation between fear of negative evaluation and state anxiety. These results, similar to the cortisol results, showed that levels of negative evaluation or social anxiety may have a significant impact on the reaction to and recovery from socially stressful events. While we did find that fear of negative evaluation predicted various outcomes across ethnicities, ethnicity did not predict fear of negative evaluation levels, which contrasts previous research. We do not know why this is, which may act as a limitation of this study. Going forward, we would like to examine the impacts of speed of recovery on physical health, as well as the impacts of state anxiety recovery speed on physical and mental health. Thank you to my PI, my grad student staff Choi, and everyone else who was involved in this study. Thank you.
It's our pleasure to introduce to you Yuja Gu. Yuja has been a research assistant working with us for almost 3 years in the Language and Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. He's worked on a lot of different projects, and he's been really essential to a lot of the work we've done.
The project Yuja is going to tell you about now is a project that he led from A to Z, using a method that we had never used before in the lab and even adapting it to be online. And it really brings together nicely his interest in bilingualism, language comprehension, prediction. And so we're very excited for you to hear about it too.
Thanks for introducing. Language prediction refers to the phenomenon that people actively predict upcoming words when comprehending language. For example, in a conversation, after hearing this following sentence, "She has a nice voice and always wanted to be a," people would be more prepared for the word singer than dancer. This is an example of context-based cueing prediction. However, no evidence suggested that bilinguals could perform this context-based prediction. In our study, we focus on another kind of cue, phonological cue, more specifically English articles. The choice of articles depends on the first sound of the next word, whether it is a consonant or a vowel. In the following two sentences, we can see that articles could be helpful in predicting the next word. Therefore, our study aims to answer this research question, that can native and non-native English speakers use English articles to predict upcoming words. During the experiment, native English speakers and Chinese English bilinguals who saw this display on the screen. They were instructed to click its object image mentioned in the question audio. Object images were organized in two conditions. In test condition, articles for two objects are different and thus are informative of the target. In control condition, two articles are the same and provide no information. We use mouse tracking this experiment to record responses. We recorded cursor positions 100 times per second to form trajectories, which could provide insight of the cognitive processing. The main measure we'll be using in analysis is maximum absolute deviation, MAD. It's the distance between the actual path and the direct path, and could measure how direct the path is. So if the listener could predict based on phonological cues, in test condition, they could start navigating to the target earlier after the target. On the contrary, in control condition, they need to wait until the onset of the noun to start navigating. Therefore, they will be faster at clicking the target image and have more direct paths in test condition. So the MAD value in the test condition will also be lower. We hypothesized that L1 speakers could predict based on English articles and will have faster responses and lower MAD values in test condition. For L2 speakers, we hypothesized that they could not do that and show no difference between conditions. The result shows that L1 speakers had shorter reaction times in test condition. L2 speakers, however, had overall longer reaction times and show no difference between two conditions. Similarly, for MAD values, L1 speakers had lower MAD values in test condition, suggesting that they could use the phonological cue English articles to predict the target object. For L2 speakers, they again show no difference between two conditions. In conclusion, L1 speakers predict upcoming words based on English articles, facilitating real-time processing. L2 speakers, however, show no difference for prediction based on English articles. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sean Green, and it's my pleasure to introduce my student Noah Phillips. Noah joined the lab in the fall of 2019, and over the last couple of years has just been an outstanding member of the lab. His thesis in particular has seen him develop methods for studying expertise that are brand new in the lab. And not only has he produced a really interesting data set here, some of those methods will likely be important for the study of expertise in the years to come. Following undergrad, he's planning on continuing on to study the psychology around esports in graduate school. And so I really look forward to seeing him in the field in the years to come.
Hi, everyone. Once again, I will be talking about competitive esports and some cognitive markers that can predict highly skilled performance. Esports, or electronic sports, is generally synonymous with competitive video gaming. Just as with traditional sports, many players dedicate significant time and energy to mastering these games and enjoy competing against other similarly motivated players. In recent years, the popularity of esports has exploded, both for competitors as well as for spectators. As more empirical research is being done in the realm of esports, one persistent gap in the literature pertains to the specificity of individual gaming genres. Just as the sport of tennis is vastly different than wrestling or basketball, many different gaming genres exist, all of which require unique skill sets. In a one-on-one fighting game such as Street Fighter, players must adapt to the actions of their human opponent while executing precise sequences of button inputs. For rhythm games such as Guitar Hero, the player executes similarly complex motor sequences, albeit in an invariable environment where players don't have to consider the actions of a human opponent. These such differences bring us to our main research question. What cognitive constructs underlie competitive gaming performance across individual genres? Our study aims to measure these constructs through a battery of cognitive assessments in hopes of isolating the particular constructs most vital to esports performance. Our participants fell into three main categories: top-level players of the fighting game and rhythm game genre, as well as gaming inexperienced individuals. All participants were recruited online via direct messaging as well as through recruitment posts made to online gaming communities. All participants went through the same task battery, which used standard cognitive assessments measuring constructs such as working memory, simple reaction time, and fluid intelligence, as well as other constructs such as rhythmic motor timing, implicit sequence learning, and sustained attention. Data analysis is still ongoing, but I can share our main hypothesis. We expect that fighting game competitors will perform better at adaptive and reaction-based cognitive tasks, while rhythm gamers will perform better at auditory rhythmic tasks. Our ultimate goal is to identify the cognitive constructs most strongly associated with top-level esports performance. In doing so, we hope to better inform training paradigms for individual games, such as this AIM trainer meant for first-person shooters, enhancing these particular cognitive faculties in a way that generalizes to improved esports performance in competition. Thank you to my thesis mentor, Dr. Sean Green, as well as the entire Learning and Transfer Lab, and thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hi, I'm Allison Bennett, and it is my pleasure and an honor to introduce Jasmine Ramos. Jasmine is a phenomenal young scholar who has been a part of my lab's collaborative team for the past 3 years. Jasmine's work on neural organization across different species of animals began in her sophomore year and has culminated in the Hilldale Senior Project you will hear about today. The work she is conducting will provide new insight into brain behavior relationships and how the brain changes with age, helping us understand both similarities and differences between human and non-human primates. I hope you enjoy hearing from Jasmine and learning more about her research. Jasmine, congratulations on your many accomplishments and well-deserved honors. We look forward to your continued success in medical school and beyond.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Ramos, and I'm excited to share my Hilldale project titled Examination of Age-Related Change in Cortical Folding Among Bonnet Macaques. With age, our brain develops. This process of brain maturation proceeds through a typical development that begins prenatally and occurs through older age. It's really important to study typical brain development as it provides integral knowledge about what typical brain development looks like and can help to identify when and how development is altered by other events and experiences. The diagram illustrates typical brain development in humans. In my study, I looked at primates, specifically bonnet macaques, and like humans, their brain maturation proceeds through a typical process. The goal of the study is to examine age-related cortical development among 3 different age groups of bonnet macaques, including infants, juveniles, and adolescents. Specifically, in this study, we looked at the development of cortical folding. Cortical folding, also known as gyrification, represents the folded structure of the brain. These folds are important because they allow for a larger surface area of the cortex to fit into a smaller amount of space, allowing for overall greater processing power. This is essential as it contributes greatly to higher order cognitive functions. For this project, we're using ITK Snap, which is a software that allows us to manually trace brain images to calculate gyrification index in order to analyze cortical folding.
Gyrification index is a measure that quantifies cortical folding by taking the total surface area of the cortex, including that buried within the brain folds, and dividing that by the amount of cortex on the outer visible cortex, which is also known as a hull. The diagram on the left shows what the tracing of the surface area looks like, and the diagram on the right shows what the tracing of the hull looks like. A cortex with a higher degree of cortical folding will have a higher gyrification index value. Results thus far suggest that brain gyrification increases with age. Further, it suggested that the front of the brain shows significant increases all throughout the 3 periods of study, whereas the back of the brain shows greater increases mostly earlier on in development. In conclusion, it is important that we continue to study what typical brain maturation and cortical development looks like to help us gain a better understanding of how other experiences can impact development. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, I'm Judy Harakevich, and it's my pleasure to introduce Luke Rutten. He's been working in our lab since fall 2019, where he's consistently challenged himself. He took my graduate seminar as a junior, and he did great work in that class. This year, he's been working on a really nice and technically ambitious thesis project. And next year, he'll be enrolling in the EdPsych doctoral program at the University of Texas. He's been working closely with Michael Asher, and I'll let Michael finish this.
Thanks, Judy. I'm Michael Asher, the graduate student who helped to supervise Luke's thesis. Luke and I spent many hours together working with a really complicated data set. I'm impressed by how much he was able to take ownership of this project and come up with creative solutions to some really difficult problems.
The focus of this study and presentation is on engagement in online learning contexts. As I'm sure most of you are aware, online learning environments are becoming increasingly common, and anecdotal experience suggests they're probably less engaging than in-person ones. Engagement, however, is an essential part of the learning experience. One way that previous research suggests may help increase engagement is the use of utility value interventions. These are based on expectancy value theory, which states that motivation is a product of both people's expectations of success and the perceived value of succeeding. One aspect of value perceptions is utility value, the usefulness of something for attaining future goals. Intervention work can aim to increase utility value in a number of ways and has been linked to a variety of desirable outcomes. When looking at outcomes of engagement in online settings, log file analysis is a relatively new and promising method of research. Every action a person takes in an online program, as well as the time they took it at, is recorded by the computer and assembled into what is known as a log file. Researchers can then take these files and look for patterns of behavior within them. And that brings us to the present study, looking at the effects of the utility value intervention in an online tutoring program. 218 students participating in the study came from 3 Pittsburgh high schools, which incorporated a virtual tutor into their math class time. Some students completed a series of utility value exercises. They read through quotes on the usefulness of math and responded to prompts asking them about quotes about how math might be useful in their lives. Survey measures consisted of relevant constructs, performance measures were pre- and post-test scores, and log file measures were made, borrowing techniques from previous literature and educational data mining. Action spamming captured times students repeatedly did the same action. Systematic guessing was identified as students trying each possible answer with little, if any, time spent thinking in between incorrect attempts. Finally, idle time was calculated by looking for long periods where the student didn't perform any actions. Action spamming, systematic guessing, and idle time all correlated with lower performance. Here, for example, we can see that the more steps a student was observed guessing on, the worse they tended to do on the test at the end of the unit. The log file measures also correlated negatively with attitudes, including interest and perceived competence. Here we can see that a student's initial interest in math predicted, to some extent, students' action spamming behaviors. For intervention effects, consistent with prior literature, the utility value intervention increased utility value and interest. Its effects on perceived competence were marginally significant, though no significant effects of the intervention were found on performance outcomes or on any of the identified log file behaviors. These findings lend support both to the use of these relatively new measures in future online studies and to previously established effects of utility value interventions. As for why the intervention didn't seem to impact performance, one potential reason could be that students simply didn't try on the pre- and post-tests as they had no real reason to. In addition, there's a lot of room for improvement with the log file measures. Lastly, I would very much like to thank everyone on this list. Without their help, this thesis would not have been possible.
Hello, this is Mark Seidenberg, and it is my pleasure to introduce Lauren Schilling, an honors student who has been working with me and with Matt Cooper Borkenhagen for the past couple of years. Lauren has been a truly outstanding undergraduate, exactly the kind of person you want to introduce to research. She's been a dedicated member of the lab working on several projects, all with a focus on using research to try to improve educational outcomes for children, in particular with respect to reading. I think Lauren's probably the most honored undergraduate in our program. Certainly she is the most honored undergraduate in my 20-some years of being at UW. She's a terrific individual with an enormous integrity and enormous talent. And I'm really glad to have had her working with us in the lab. So here is Lauren.
Hi, my name is Lauren Schilling, and I'm a research assistant working with Mark Seidenberg and Matt Cooper Borkenhagen in the language and cognitive neuroscience. My project is more than meets the eye, sight words, and early reading instruction. Over the past 200 years, educators have debated how to teach children to read. Most schools today use a balanced literacy approach, where teachers help their students to sound out regular words and recognize exception words by sight. These sight words have been an important part of reading instruction because there's a lot of weird words like yacht or pint that actually don't have normal sound spelling matching. My mentors and I noticed that there's no clear definition of a sight word. There's lots of variability in sight word qualities across different books. My research focuses on the qualities of first grade sight words in 6 popular reading programs. These programs represent a range of reading instructional approaches. The Wonders and Foundation word lists come from popular comprehensive reading curricula. Johnson Canal and Orton-Gillingham word lists come from popular reading intervention programs. The Mr. Raff word list comes from a highly rated user on Teachers Pay Teachers, which is a site where teachers upload and sell their educational materials. And lastly, the Mondo word list comes from the curriculum used in Madison Metropolitan School District. So far, our analyses have shown that there's little agreement in sight word qualities across these lists. From left to right, you can see the average word measurements from Francis and Fennell, Foundation, Mr. Raff, Mondo, Orton-Gillingham, and Wonders. We found that the average word length ranges from 3.34 letters in Francis and Fennell to 4.72 letters in the Mondo list. Next, we looked at imageability, which describes how easily we can picture a word's meaning in our mind's eye. Here we can see that the Wonders and Mr. Raff words are the most imageable, and the Mondo and Orton-Gillingham words are the least imageable. Frequency describes how often a word is used. We found that the average Francis and Fennell word is highly frequent, used about 4,600 times in first grade level children's books, while the average words from Wonders are highly infrequent, used about 1,700 times. Lastly, word surprisal describes how irregular a word's pronunciation is. The more surprising it is, the more irregular its letter sound mappings are. The words in Foundation are the most surprising with a rating of 2.11, while the Wonders words are the most predictable with a rating of 1.06. The ongoing work raises questions about the words that are necessary and important to efficiently teach children to read. Our findings point to a need for a stronger consensus on the definition and purpose of a sight word. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to introduce to you Ariel Yang. I first met Ariel when she was a student in my Psychology of Women and Gender class, and from that I learned that she's just an excellent student. This year she's working on a senior honors thesis with me that's a review of research on the effectiveness of college sexual assault prevention programs. And she's done great work on that review. I'm also pleased to say that she has not just one, but actually 2 graduate school acceptances. So congratulations, Ariel.
Sexual assault on college campuses is recognized as a major public health issue because it affects millions of U.S. college students every year. This review aims to first analyze the current college sexual assault prevention programs, second, identify the effective components of the current programs, and third, discuss the limitations of current studies and future directions. According to a recent campus climate survey, 26% of undergraduate women and 7% of undergraduate men have experienced at least one incident of unwanted sex on campus. Possible mental consequences of sexual victimization include anxiety, depression, and PTSD. An example for physical consequences is sexually transmitted infections. These negative consequences can translate into difficulties in various domains of life. This review analyzed 40 studies according to their program characteristics and program outcomes. The modality, duration, content, facilitator, and audience of the intervention programs are evaluated for program characteristics. Program outcomes are evaluated in terms of attitudinal and behavioral change. Here, I'll illustrate two positive outcomes in relation to their program characteristics. The most commonly found positive outcome in attitudinal change is decreased rape myth acceptance. This result is observed consistently across different program design. However, it should be noted that backlash on rape attitude was found in some men-only programs. A commonly reported outcome in behavioral change is self-reported bystander behavior. Over half of the studies focusing on bystander intervention include interactive components. This design is associated with increased self-reported bystander behavior. In current studies, researchers often ended up excluding non-cisgender and non-heterosexual students due to the insufficient sample size. However, these students have experienced incidents of campus sexual assault at a higher rate. Therefore, researchers should bring their attention to studies focusing on this population in the future. Another limitation is the lack of long-term follow-ups. One suggestion is to take advantage of the first-year student sample. These participants are relatively early in their college career, so researchers can record the trajectory of their attitudinal and behavioral change. The longitudinal design will also help researchers to determine whether these intervention programs are actually reducing the prevalence of campus sexual assault in the long run. I'd like to take this time to thank my mentor, Dr. Janet Hyde. I also want to thank Dr. Patricia Devine, my classmates in Psych 686, and the Department of Gender and Women's Studies for their feedback and support. And thank you for listening.
Dasha Yarmel has been a member of the Niedenthal Emotions Lab for 2.5 years now. She's been involved in every phase of our research activities, from designing experiments through data collection to the interpretation and writing of our findings. She's been an invaluable member of the lab. For her senior thesis, Dasha conducted several studies on how the wearing of face masks, those that we see every day now during the pandemic, influences people's perceptions of our emotion as we express them on our face. These findings have implications for many things, even including how we interact with people at a grocery store and the nature of our interactions with our friends on the sidewalks as we pass them. Please give your undivided attention to Dasha as she presents her findings from her senior thesis, and thank you so much.
We are typically experts at interpreting emotions from a large set of facial expressions that we see through everyday social interactions. But our social interactions drastically changed when everyone started consistently covering the lower half of their face with masks due to the global pandemic. So, do masks influence our ability to recognize and interpret facial expressions? Some prior work on faces covered by pacifiers, niqabs, and even a hat and scarf influenced participants to misinterpret the affect and intensity of certain facial expressions. However, the competing reading the mind in the eyes hypothesis suggests that people's internal states and intentions can be perceived from the eyes alone. Prior work led to my first hypothesis that people are less accurate at recognizing facial expressions with masks compared to fully visible faces. I also predict that when wearing masks, expressions that contain more facial muscle movements on the upper portion of the face, such as anger and surprise, will be more accurately recognized compared to those that contain more facial muscle movements on the lower portion of the face, such as disgust and happiness. So in my study, I included 4 emotions and 4 types of facial coverings. 162 workers from Amazon Mechanical Turk completed an online Qualtrics survey where they viewed videos of 14 different actors displaying one of the 4 emotions with or without a mask. For each video and on a scale from 0 to 100, participants rated the extent to which an actor was expressing a given emotion. Across all 4 mask conditions and in line with my first hypothesis, participants rate that masked anger expressions are communicating less anger compared to fully visible anger expressions. However, when rating the non-target emotions for the same anger videos, masked anger expressions are perceived as more disgusted, surprised, or happy compared to visible anger expressions. This suggests that masked faces might be more ambiguous and confused for other expressions. Similarly, we see the same trends for disgust expressions, surprise expressions, and happiness expressions. In line with my second hypothesis, I found a significant interaction between facial action predominance and face presentation. These results indicate that masks disrupt emotion perception to a greater extent for faces that involve more lower compared to upper facial action predominance. I found support for both hypotheses in this project, and an important takeaway is that masked faces might be more ambiguous and confused for other expressions. So when wearing masks, we should amp up our use of verbal communication and body gestures to help convey our emotions. I'd like to thank my collaborators from the Niedenthal Emotions Lab for their support on this project.
Thank you everyone for attending, and congratulations to the presenters for their remarkable achievements. And to the presenters today. Engaging in science is about collaborations, supporting each other, seeking truth, and advancing knowledge to better our lives and our communities. I, in the Department of Psychology, thank you for your contributions and wish you the best going forward. And one last thing, as you continue to be successful, and I know you will because you just demonstrated you are, always remember to reach back and lift up others along your journey. Thank you, and on Wisconsin.